Hello, everyone, and welcome to lesson 3 of our course on living religion in the Georgian and Regency periods. Over the last couple of days, I've looked more broadly at the diversity and division of religious opinion in the period. We looked at the proliferation of different groups and even different movements within, for example, the Anglican Church. And we've also looked at how these movements and denominations interact with each other a little bit through a discussion of toleration and intolerance. Now today, we're going to be zeroing in. Right back in the first lesson, I talked about superstition and enthusiasm as categories, and those are the categories that we're going to be looking at today. I'm going to be doing a couple of different things. I'm going to be looking at the way in which particularly enthusiasm was used or applied to specific denominations, but I'm also going to be looking at how these terms were applied outside of a denominational context to describe or even critique ideas, beliefs, and practices. One of the reasons that I've put these together is because in a lot of the discussions of the period, they were either conflated or it was underlined that these were related properties of religion. And I think that this satirical print that we've seen before, Enthusiasm Delineated, is a really good example of how they were understood to be interrelated in the period. We have here the Methodist minister, his wig flying back to reveal the Catholic tonsure. A really good indication that they're seen as posing perhaps the same threat, using the same techniques, or coming from a very similar place. But how were these terms, superstition and enthusiasm, understood in the period? Well, if we're wanting to differentiate between them and understand specifically how they were used, we can't do better than looking at David Hume's Of Superstition and Enthusiasm. Now, he makes a particular point of differentiating between them and how they function and where they come from. What aspects of religious practice define these categories of superstition and enthusiasm? For Hume, superstition is based in weakness, fear, melancholy, ignorance. And it lends itself, let us say, to manipulation from outside forces. Here he goes on a rant about the origin of priests. He says, the origin of priests who may justly be regarded as an invention of a timorous and abject superstition, which, ever diffident of itself, dares not offer up its own devotions, but ignorantly thinks to recommend itself to the divinity by the mediation of his supposed friends and servants. As superstition is a considerable ingredient in almost all religions, even the most fanatical, there being nothing but philosophy able entirely to conquer these unaccountable terrors. Hence it proceeds that in almost every sect of religion there are priests to be found, but the stronger mixture there is of superstition, the higher is the authority of the priesthood. So there are a couple of things to note here. First of all, although superstition in the period is often used when discussing Catholicism, they're not synonymous terms. Here, Hume makes it clear that we can talk about superstitious structures or practices in almost all religious groups, and he's taking a bit of a potshot here at Anglicanism as well, you might suggest. He also points to the fact that superstition is connected to fear. But this is a fear which forces you to apply to other people to explain the world and to mediate between you and your lack of knowledge and to mediate between you and the divine. Hence, the origin of priests. He suggests that the more superstitious a religion, the more formal it will become with greater hierarchies, which will mean that you are increasingly far from knowledge, increasingly far from divinity, and increasingly liable to be preyed upon by the unscrupulous. Now, we'll return back to this idea of superstition right at the end of today's session, but remember that connection to fear for when we get there. Now, enthusiasm, as it's applied, he suggests, is connected to hope, pride, presumption, a warm imagination, together with ignorance. Those are the forces that produce enthusiasm. And here he lays out how enthusiasm or enthusiastic religions begin. In little time, the inspired person comes to regard himself as a distinguished favorite of the divinity. And when this frenzy once takes place, which is the summit of enthusiasm, every whimsy is consecrated. Human reason and even morality are rejected as fallacious guides, and the fanatic madman delivers himself over blindly and without reserve to the supposed elapses of the spirit and to inspiration from above. So you can see here an emphasis on new religions, new revelations. And enthusiasm as a term is often implied to this sense of personal revelation and personal interaction with the divine. One thing that's worth noting about the period, as I've already said, is that these were seen often as being connected. And there are discussions about the way in which enthusiasm perhaps eventually turns into superstition. So one of the examples of this is this absolutely massive tome by Bishop George Lavington, The Enthusiasm of the Methodists and the Papists Compared. So he looks at a number of enthusiastic Catholic groups throughout history, from the Montanists to Francis of Assisi, and suggests that what starts off as an enthusiastic sense of new revelation eventually becomes systematized into a superstitious, priest-filled model of religion. But he notes that in both, where we start is with this idea that every flash of zeal and devotion, every wild pretension, scheme, tenet, and overbearing dictate, impulses, impressions, feelings, impetuous transports and raptures, intoxicating vapors and fumes of imagination, phantoms of a crazy brain, and uncouth effects of a distempered mind or body, their sleeping or waking dreams, their actions and passions, etc., all are ascribed with an amazing presumption to the extraordinary interposition of heaven. So you can see here, up for debate, wider theological question that's occurring is, do we actually have conversation with the divine? That's worth bearing in mind as a background discourse that's going on here. So we've talked about enthusiasm, so you must be expecting some pretty exciting things to be going on with these enthusiastic groups. Raptures, transports, intoxicating vapors. Well, let's have a look at the group that was most commonly denominated enthusiastic in the period. Methodism, of course. So what are the aspects of Methodism which lent to it this reputation of enthusiasm? Well, first of all, you've got these large outdoor preaching sessions, which often resulted in either rebirth for the congregants, a change in life, or sort of quite severe physical responses. And I have added in the materials for today some examples of this from Wesley's own diaries, John Wesley. It was associated with charismatic, often called enthusiastic preaching, that which worked on the emotions and the nerves, which created not only a rational but an emotional response to make you feel your salvation. So particularly George Whitefield, William Bramwell, Hugh Bourne, and Lorenzo Dow were credited with this style of charismatic preaching, which was seen as very suspect by more orthodox religious groups. That emphasis on rebirth and renewal and this moment of accepting or being indwelt by the Spirit was also something that was suspect, in part because it relied on this idea of a great change that was necessary, something which was theologically very debatable in the period, but also because the manifestation of this rebirth or renewal was often physical or very overt. There was also in Methodist groups often a belief in prophecy and personal revelation, but also in dreams, visions, and miracles. So Wesley himself was renowned for this belief in dreams, visions, and miracles. Although we will see again in the extra materials for today that he wasn't quite the credulous believer in everything that he's often portrayed of as being. We also have some interesting aspects of Methodism. Now, the Methodists were really key in the popularity of hymns and the dissemination of hymns into the 18th and into the 19th century. But some of the imagery of their hymns was considered to be really quite beyond the bounds. So one of the ones that I've always really enjoyed is one that talks about drinking Jesus's blood and languishing in his wounds. So it's quite blood-heavy imagery. And there's a scholar called Christopher Herbert who suggests that the vampire and how it manifests, particularly in the 19th century, is influenced by these sort of Wesleyan and Methodist depictions of Christianity and blood drinking. Now, another thing that put Methodism on the outside was the fact that women could preach. Not in all the groups and not forever. So Wesley started off allowing women to become itinerant preachers, but by 1803, that practice had gone within the main Arminian church, at least. However, women continued to preach in other groups, as we'll see, other Methodist groups, as we'll see. But the fact that women were preaching, were moving around the countryside, had religious authority, was something that was very shocking and very frowned upon for many. We also have sort of moments of revival, which added to this sense of the enthusiasm, because it's just this newness, often manifesting in quite extreme ways. And we have the 1790 revival based on a lot of hellfire preaching as well. So you've got all of these enthusiastic elements, but how does this translate into daily Methodist life? Was it all rolling around, overcome by the Spirit? Well, no, obviously not. The Methodists also, as I've talked about before, had this emphasis on a moral life. So the daily Methodist life promoted by Wesley was about daily prayer, occasional fasting, family and individual meditation upon scripture on a daily basis, charitable work, community support through the small group systems that they had, that I'll discuss in a second, and an emphasis on hospitality, particularly because Wesleyan preachers did not stay in one place. They were on a circuit. So in a circuit in a specific area where they would go around preaching at the different locations. So hospitality, and hospitality towards preachers particularly, was a key part of this Methodist life. Communion itself, and not just religious communion, but communion within your community, or communion with your community, was a key part of Methodist life. So this wasn't just about occasional church attendance. Attendance at Anglican communion until at least 1795 for the Arminians and 1810 for the Calvinists was sort of prescribed. They also had the society meetings of the Methodist groups in the area, and then they had smaller group meetings, which would also be regular up to weekly. Class meetings were up to about 12 people. They could be a mix of genders and of classes. Band meetings were smaller with 5 people. These were spaces of accountability and also of sharing about spiritual renewal. You also had the love feasts, occasional, maybe quarterly, which were sort of large group meetings. They had a sort of liturgy and set out, but also included a feast. And then, of course, for the ministers, you had a quarterly system of ministerial conferences. So there was quite a lot of order to Methodist life and a sense of Methodist community being created. You also have, from the 1780s, with the rise of the Sunday school movement more generally, you have the Methodist Sunday schools becoming a key part of Methodist practice. And this is something that I'll be discussing next week a little bit more when we talk about education and faith. Now, we talked about before Anglicans, there's not just one Anglican. We know that there's not just one Methodist, because we know there's Arminians and Calvinists, but there are lots of different breakaway Methodist groups as well. And just a quick survey of them, because this is where you're getting into perhaps the more overtly enthusiastic practices. The Magic Methodists, straight in there, with quite obvious why they were known as enthusiastic. They were also called the Forest Methodists, and headed by a man called James Crowfoot, who was originally a preacher on the Norwich circuit. But he was expelled in 1807 for his irregular practices. So while he was on the circuit, he'd also been conducting monthly services near his home, which involved prophecy and visions, and often resulted in people entering trance states. So a really high emphasis here on this kind of mystical side. He had a reputation himself for spiritual powers, particularly prophecy, and he emphasized the role and importance of dreams, trances, and prophecies in his meetings and in his group, which garnered together quite a few people in a charismatic evangelical group here. The Tent Methodists were a 19th century group. Now, after Wesley's death, the Arminian Methodists, under the leadership of Jabez Bunting, became sort of increasingly conservative, if you will. But there were a number of members who resisted this and wanted to continue with a more sort of charismatic and evangelical bent. Now, one of these was George Pocock. He, a fun fact, he was the inventor of the Charvolent. I'm not quite sure how you say it, but I'll show you a picture in a second. He was the son of an Anglican and a Methodist preacher himself, but he wanted to focus more on evangelical outreach. So as well as doing his circuit, he also led mission close to his home. He constructed a tent that could hold 500 people, and it moved around, particularly around Bristol, Gloucestershire, Somerset, and Wiltshire. He was expelled from the Methodist Bristol Society in 1820 because he refused to let them have control over these tent meetings. But after a number of years, in 1832, the Tent Methodist movement sort of ended. It lost steam, and he did move back into the circuit in 1835. But this is a sort of charismatic movement, having these massive open air, tented charismatic meetings. The Primitive Methodists, again, were another group that weren't happy with this lack of emphasis on evangelism. They were some of them were led by Hugh Bourne. He'd been influenced by an American evangelist, Lorenzo Dow. The Primitive Methodists were primarily formed of the lower classes, and they emphasized the democratic government, and these were one of the groups that still had spaces for women preaching. So women had a sort of higher status in the Primitive Methodists as well. They emphasized a more informal worship style, moving away from the kind of conservative liturgical emphasis of the main Wesleyan movement. And again, they had that focus on evangelism and camp meetings, and they continued for quite a long time as a separate denomination. Perhaps in terms of their politics, the most radical of the Wesleyans, who tended towards a sort of social conservatism. Now, the last of the groups to mention are the Bible Christians, who were headed by William O'Brien. Now, he again is sort of connected to this urge to do more evangelism. He was, again, preaching on the circuit in Devon and Cornwall. He did not want to be limited by the teaching schedule. Instead, he said that he would go wherever God called him. So he preached primarily in Devon and Cornwall, although the missions were set up throughout the United Kingdom. They were particularly successful in Kent, the Channel Islands, and the Isle of Wight. But the Isle of Wight was also the scene of persecution, and it's quite a good example of how persecution of dissenting groups continued, not necessarily enforced by the law, but a de facto kind of part of life. So they were opposed in the Isle of Wight by Samuel Wilberforce, son of William Wilberforce, who you know for more positive reasons perhaps. And Samuel was, of course, also an opposer of Darwin. So he's really not on the right track with quite a few things here. But he campaigned for members to lose their jobs in the local area. He campaigned for them to be removed from their homes. And so they were really sort of isolated from their community, and they would go out to a chalk pit to have their preaching. The Bible Christians also emphasize recognize the right of women to preach, and there are several sort of really important women in that movement, one of whom is Mary Toms, who was instrumental in the revival in the Isle of Wight, and they were called, which I think is pretty cool, female special agents. So I told you I would show you what a Charvolent was. So Pocock was an inventor as well as the leader of the tent meetings. And this is his magical vehicle that he designed, which is a chariot drawn by a kite, which I think is the beginning of an amazing romance story. In the painting here, we have this sort of vision, I'm not sure if you can see it or not, of multiple chariots drawn by kites in different directions, the possibilities of travel by kite. So the Methodists, as we can see, had enthusiastic elements, although they were often painted with a brush of enthusiasm that they didn't necessarily deserve in terms of how they were living their daily lives and how generally preaching, teaching, and learning went. Now, there are other enthusiastic groups of the 18th century, and here are literally just a few of them. There are a lot more than this. So a major voice was Swedenborg, who was Swedish. His work was coming out in the sort of the early to mid 18th century, but continued to have influence. And there are Swedenborgians still today. So he believed that he had visions. He wrote, I think it's up to 19 books of his visions, that he was able to enter heaven and hell and discourse with angels. So there was a real emphasis in his work on the kind of this, on these visions, on these dreams, on this new revelation. Now, Joanna Southcott, many of you might already know, was a late 18th and early 19th century prophetess. She was known as the Woman of the Apocalypse because she was predicting, to some extent, the apocalypse. She also went through sort of various stages of her life. She was a Methodist, then she started to have visions, dreams, and prophecies going on. At one point, she was in London selling these seals, so that if you had the seal, you were one of the elect, one of the 144,000 who would end up in heaven. And at her death, people believed in her so strongly that they didn't bury her. They didn't announce that she was dead until at least the day after she died. So her death is recorded as the 27th of December, but it's likely that she died on the 26th because they refused to sort of announce her death until she started to smell. But there were still people believing in Southcott's prophecies, and perhaps there still are today, but with quite a lasting influence. Another contemporary prophet, much less well known today, I think, is Richard Brothers. And you can see here a satirical print called The Prophet of the Hebrews by James Gilray. So Richard Brothers had a number of claims through his lifetime. He claimed to be able to heal. He claimed to be able to prophesy. He claimed he was the nephew of Christ. He was also one of the sort of first British Israelist thinkers who argued that the 10 lost tribes of Israel had ended up in the United Kingdom, and that he was come to lead them to peace, safety, and freedom. He ended up committed to an asylum, living there for much of his life, although he was released into somebody's care in 1806 and then lived under their care until 1824. But you can see from the satirical print that he was considered to be a threat, very much a threat, and his version of sort of this anarchic religious thinking was viewed as a threat to the social order. And you can see that from the red caps reminiscent of the French Revolutionary gear. So we've had a look at enthusiasm, or as an enthusiastic group, or a couple of groups there. And just to finish off, I'm going to be sort of pointing to this idea of superstition and enthusiasm as interpretative frameworks. So as I said, you'll find frequently in late 18th and 19th century literature, people being accused of superstition or enthusiasm, particularly in Gothic literature, which is obviously my raison d'etre, but more broadly as well. And these weren't just used in literature, they were also used as terms to decry people's opinions in public debates about theologically relevant issues, such as, my two examples here, dreams and ghosts. So dreams was a subject which was being completely re-understood in the 18th and 19th centuries. There was an advance of medicalized and proto-psychological knowledge, but they still remained within the realm of theological explanation. They were something that people experienced on a daily basis and contained frequently things that people could not explain, that appeared either prophetic or revelatory or simply meaningful. Now, you had the sort of dream guides. One of my favorites says that black cats means that you want somebody to be executed for robbery, which is a sad thing, that I apparently want thousands of people to die. But I don't, just FYI. But those dream guides were largely considered to be, they weren't taken seriously, let us say. But discussions about the dream as potentially meaningful, potentially a means of divine communication, did continue throughout the 19th century and up into the 20th century. Now, as we've seen, enthusiastic groups, people like the Methodists and prophets like Joanna Southcott, believed completely in the power of dreams as a vehicle of divine communication. But We also have the case that other people, moderate Anglicans, Presbyterians, even Unitarians occasionally, were not willing to simply dismiss the dream and its potential to carry theological meaning. So dreams in the 17th and 18th century frequently occurred in anti-Sadducean literature. Now, anti-Sadducean literature were collections of stories which were used to sort of disprove materialism and to disprove atheistical denial of a belief in a spiritual or supernatural world. And dreams frequently occurred in these, being offered as proof of a body and soul division. So the soul is active while your body is sleeping. And also proof of providence quite frequently, because they were open to divine and demonic influence. They could be vehicles for divine communication or for demonic temptation. The reason why they were it was so hard to let go of these theologized ideas of the dream is partly because of the things I've already discussed. The experience of dreams, the lack of explication for some dreams, and the way they were used as theological proof of key points like body-soul division. But there's also biblical precedent for prophetic dreams. And to deny the possibility of prophetic dreams was to deny the Bible. That was a point that was regularly made in the 18th and 19th centuries. The medicalized explanations, as I've suggested, they weren't quite enough. So this theological framework continued to be applied alongside them. So there's a Reverend Saalfeld in the 18th century whose work was translated into English in 1764, who says there are three types of dreams: divine dreams, angelic or demonic dreams, and completely natural dreams. So people were using these medicalized explanations, but putting them alongside the possibility of theological meaning. Now, ghosts often were addressed in fairly similar ways. Now, there was an extra barrier that ghosts were not something that people were experiencing all the time. And there was this link as well to testimony. Ghosts, you usually heard about ghosts from other people. So there's also the question of, do you believe those other people? But ghosts also featured in anti-Sadducean literature. They were considered as evidence of the immateriality and immortality of the soul. They were under debate, though, because, of course, there was no real theological framework that explained them within Protestantism. In Catholicism, they were explained by the possibility of purgatory, from which people could perhaps go and come back. But in Protestant theology, there wasn't really an explanation for them, but people tended to gloss over that. Now, Wesley was a ghost believer. You may or may not know this, but his childhood home was haunted, and he was very staunch in believing that ghosts could possibly exist. So you have an example there of what might be denominated, or what would be later denominated, enthusiastic ghost belief. But there's a differentiation between what was considered superstitious ghost belief and enthusiastic ghost belief. Superstitious ghost belief was basically folk belief, if you will, or the belief in a sort of Catholic ghost system. And it was often connected as well, very specifically in both literature and discourse in the period, to fear. If you had a superstitious ghost belief, you were ruled by fear, and you weren't thinking clearly about what ghosts actually were. Because within a Protestant framework, it didn't quite work. Ghosts would be the returning dead, allowed back by providence with some sort of mission. If you were virtuous, they weren't here to punish you. So there is no need for fear. So this idea of superstitious ghost belief is specifically linked to the expression of fear and the parroting of either folk beliefs or Catholic beliefs. Enthusiastic ghost belief, on the other hand, and we see this quite frequently in Radcliffe's literature, particularly the Mysteries of Udolpho, is the over interpretation of signs and ghosts, particularly. So, excuse me, enthusiastic ghost belief is the use of ghosts to either produce new knowledge, to suggest that you're getting new revelations from the mouth of ghosts, or to suggest that you have particular privileged access to a spiritual realm. Now, a really interesting example of how these debates all sort of figure in real life is the Lamb's Inn case in Bristol. And I've put a link on the materials again to a case study on the Lamb's Inn case. It was a Bristol inn which was potentially haunted by a poltergeist. And it became the center of a massive debate in 1762. And this debate was continued on religious lines quite frequently, with more conservative Anglican preachers denying the possibility of this possession and being called atheists and deists, and with a number of dissenting ministers believing in the possibility of this visitation and being called out as either superstitious or enthusiastic, mostly enthusiastic. But we have this element also of superstitious ghost belief, because the ghost or the poltergeist was eventually got rid of by a white witch, a folk practitioner who used an age-old remedy of urine in a bottle. There you go. This is one of the texts that is produced around it. So it's a case study that you can actually see and look at in detail from the contemporary records as well. Now, I've gone through this very, very briefly, but I've given 2-hour lectures on both of these topics, the history of ghost belief and dream belief. So I'll link those into the resources for today if you're interested in learning a little bit more. Now, I'm going to finish by pointing how these things become part of the literary tradition of the period, as I'm doing every day. Now, in Gothic literature, there is quite frequently an emphasis on this problem of navigating the shoals of interpretative practice when confronted with the supernatural, with the miraculous, with the potentially providential, with a dream that you can't quite explain, with a noise in the night that you don't know where it comes from. And there are 3 different frameworks that you're going to want to avoid. You're going to want to avoid superstitious fear that believes anything and is afraid of all. You're going to want to avoid enthusiastic belief in your privileged ability to commune with the supernatural. You're also going to want to avoid atheism, the outright denial of the possibility of the supernatural. And it's notable that in most Gothic novels, the only people you'll find denying the very possibility of the supernatural are villains. So an example, just to finish us off with how this debate manifests and how these different positions are navigated, is found in Anne Radcliffe's A Sicilian Romance. Now, this was her second novel from 1790. Not one of her best, well, not as well written as some of her others, but a very jolly read, a much quicker read than many of her later novels. But here you have Madame Menon being asked, do you believe in ghosts? Can ghosts exist? And she replies, my children, I will not attempt to persuade you that the existence of such spirits is impossible. Who shall say that anything is impossible to God? We know that he has made us who are embodied spirits. He therefore can make unembodied spirits. If we cannot understand how such spirits exist, we should consider the limited powers of our minds, and that we cannot understand many things which are indisputably true. No one yet knows why the magnetic needle points to the north, yet you, who have never seen a magnet, do not hesitate to believe that it has this tendency, because you have been well assured of it, both from books and in conversations. Since, therefore, we are sure that nothing is impossible to God, and that such beings may exist, though we cannot tell how, we ought to consider by what evidence their existence is supported. I do not say that spirits have appeared, but if several discreet, unprejudiced persons were to assure me that they had seen one, I should not be proud or bold enough to reply, it is impossible. Let not, however, such considerations disturb your minds. I have said thus much because I was unwilling to impose upon your understandings. It is now your part to exercise your reason and preserve the unmoved confidence of virtue. Such spirits, if indeed they have ever been seen, can have appeared only by the express permission of God, and for some very singular purpose. Be assured that there are no beings who act unseen by him, and that therefore there are none from whom innocence can ever suffer harm. So she's navigating all of those positions here. She's avoiding atheism by saying that spirits are possible, that there is that is beyond our understanding, and affirming that nothing is impossible for God. She's avoiding superstition by blindly believing in any ghost story that turns up. But she's also avoiding enthusiasm because she claims no special knowledge or access to knowledge for herself. She implies that we should have a via media, putting these experiences and these testimonies to the test of evidence or logic, but never quite stepping into the realm of denying their possibility. So that's how you navigate superstition enthusiasm and atheism, perhaps. We've come to the end of the input for today. So the same questions as usual. First of all, has any of this sprung up any ideas for you about how you can incorporate these things into your texts? I would love to see in everything I read, but some really in-depth and nuanced ideas of the approach to the ghostly. Because saying that something is superstitious has a very specific meaning in the period and isn't quite enough to broach or to deal with the concept of the ghost, because you might be avoiding superstition, but have you avoided enthusiasm and atheism? You got to avoid them all. Anyway, that's my first point. My second point is, I know that a lot of you are working on really interesting books in the period, and I'm interested if you have any religious figures that would fall into this enthusiastic denomination, either figures that you've researched or heard about, or ones that you're including in your books. I'd love to know. I'd love to know who's an enthusiast that you have researched or that you would like to share with us just generally. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will see you tomorrow.